Welcome to the new Hegelian Philosophy channel and the new Absent Connection Newscast. Well, you could probably guess what the Absent Connection Newscast is a continuation of. Well, though we cannot say the original name anymore on YouTube, we can still get something close enough with the help of a thesaurus. And it's interesting that we would start the whole newscast with that because we'll be coming back to that theme of a thesaurus a little later when talking about what AI really is and what it really does. But at any rate, AI seems to be making great strides forward in progress, even the sort of progress which is no longer fun for especially the people who have just gotten the pink slip. It's an interesting sort of progress we see in which the sign that the economy is thriving is that 30,000 people at Amazon, one of the world's wealthiest and most productive corporations, have just lost their jobs. Now, it's interesting that this news would be coming now in the beginning of November because typically that's when Amazon would actually need more people. The holiday season is when some industries see their biggest sales. I remember 20 years ago talking to a guy who ran a little mom and pop cowboy paraphernalia store in Colorado selling cowboy hats and things of that nature. He said about 50% of his yearly sales were just Christmas gifts. There are certain things which people will only buy as Christmas gifts for others. So it's interesting that early November is when Amazon, of all people, has announced 30,000 layoffs, which, if we put that into context, is one of the biggest layoffs by a single company in American history. You'd have to go back to the 2000s to find comparable numbers from, say, GM and Ford. So, granted, at the beginning of the Great Recession and the lead up to it, you did have like 46,000 layoffs by Ford, comparable numbers by GM, but that's because they were literally going out of business. If it had not been for the bailout by Obama in 2009, there would be no car industry in Detroit today. But it's interesting that Amazon is basically doing the same thing, 30,000 job cuts in the Christmas season, at a time when they're supposed to be one of the most valuable corporations in the world, and the jobs that are being cut are not quote-unquote low-level jobs in the warehouse, where, okay, maybe it's understandable that a robot can pull orders faster than a human, it needs no bathroom break, it never gets sick, it can work 24 hours a day, but those actually are not the jobs that have been cut. It's 30,000 corporate jobs, many of them on the higher scale of income. According to Michael Bordenero, the people losing their jobs at Amazon are probably the ones making between $150,000 and $300,000 per year. Certainly people who never would have considered themselves to be replaceable, let alone by a thing like ChatGPT. But if we believe the media's reporting on this, and if we believe Amazon CEO's own portrayal of this situation, then that's exactly what has happened. ChatGPT has become intelligent enough to replace not just entry-level workers. Oh, by the way, class of 2025, that job will never exist again. The entry-level job will never exist again, but thanks for agreeing to take on 6 figures of student loan debt for a job you will never be able to do. Well, it's not just the entry-level jobs now, it's actually the high-ranking jobs at the world's wealthiest corporations, which can now be done by ChatGPT. Well, if you're the CEO of NVIDIA, who's now become the first $5 trillion company in history, if you're the CEO of NVIDIA, then certainly that is how you are going to portray the situation, because you want to keep raking in all of that money for the chips, which actually at the end of the day are more like graphics cards, which were not designed for AI purposes. They're now being coerced or jury-rigged to do. Rather, they were designed for video games, but be that as it may, whereas NVIDIA's stock used to be $12 a share when it was considered for video games, now it's $200 a share. At any rate, if you're the CEO of NVIDIA who's making out like a bandit as a result of this, then that's certainly how you'll want to portray the situation. But if you actually use ChatGPT for something more difficult than, say, having a college kid cheat on their homework by having the robot do it for them, then you'll find that these promises are a little overblown. So certainly if you're a lazy college kid who'd rather get drunk tonight with your buddies than read a short book which was assigned by your professor and write a 3-page paper, then yeah, ChatGPT sounds smart enough to take what somebody else wrote on the internet and then condense it into a shorter form and use a thesaurus to change some of the words or to tweak the grammatical structure so it can't be caught as matching an already published article. But if you try to ask ChatGPT to do slightly more difficult things, it really struggles. Nick Jurley of Reventure Consulting noted that even making spreadsheets is too hard for ChatGPT. He found that if it just asks it to find information and then put it into an Excel spreadsheet, it struggles so much that Nick Jurley said he's actually just faster doing it himself. He saves time by just finding the information himself. And at the end of the day, that's what ChatGPT basically amounts to. It may save a little bit of time providing the shorter version of something already written, so you don't have to read the whole thing. But at what cost? Well, with regard to the cost of all of this, some people are now finding out the hard way how extremely expensive it is for if you are unfortunate enough to live near one of these data centers, like people in, say, Columbus, Ohio, your electricity bills have already doubled within the past few years. In fact, overall electricity consumption in the United States increased 4% last year, no doubt because of this. So it really is an extremely serious matter, the amount of resources that are required to power a technology which we're told is smart enough to replace everybody's job. I mean, we're told that it's smart enough to do things which even defy the laws of thermodynamics. One of the arguments by the so-called effective accelerationists is that we should keep accelerating the process even when it gets painful. Even if you lose your $300,000 a year job, we got to keep accelerating it because the AI will eventually be able to create solar panels that have a net return on energy that actually defies the laws of physics. So it's impossible, but if we keep accelerating the process, the AI can do it. Well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, it seems, with regard to the abilities of something which at the end of the day is more like a spell check. So whereas a spell check on your word processor is convenient because it saves you the trouble of getting off your butt to walk over to the shelf and open up a Webster dictionary, which few homes now have, but back in the 90s when I grew up, every home did, of opening up the Webster dictionary and flipping to the page out of 2000 that contains your entry to manually check whether you spelled it right. Well, it's certainly convenient to have a spell check on your word processor do that for you, although many students who do still write their papers don't even bother to take the 5 seconds to run it before submitting their paper to their teacher. But the difference is that the spell check didn't cause your electricity bill to double. It didn't consume so much water in the process of cooling down the operations within the data center to the point that the graphics cards, which are now being used for tasks they were not designed for. They were designed for video games, not for this sort of AI work, to prevent them from literally melting in the process of doing their work. The cost in terms of energy, the cost in terms of water for something basically like a spell check after a certain point may not seem to be worth it anymore. For would you want to lose access to all electricity for a technology which is mostly suited for helping college students cheat on their homework so they can get drunk more often with their friends? Would you want to lose access to running water, to showers and things of that nature, to flushing toilets, for something which at the end of the day is kind of like the thesaurus which Joey Tribbiani used in that one episode of Friends. You may recall that Joey was advised, you can sound a little more intelligent by changing a few words within your letter with a thesaurus. Bigger words, quote unquote, will accomplish that task. Well, he decided in accord with basic common sense that if a few changes will make me sound a little smarter, won't changing every word in the document make me sound even smarter? Only to find after changing every word that the letter was now signed by Baby Kangaroo Tribbiani. So it's humorous when a guy in a sitcom overuses the thesaurus to show, ironically, that he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. But when the AI is also overusing the thesaurus and then giving us results that are actual garbage, we're calling it the greatest sign of progress in the history of mankind. We have promises by CEOs now that AI is comparable to the invention of the internet, or even more extreme, the invention of fire. I kid you not, the invention of fire or the invention of the wheel is the same sort of game-changing moment in history that we are supposedly living through now, with something that actually produces about 20% of the time total nonsense. You may have heard about AI hallucinations, in which the AI, which mostly just condenses down what has already been written on the internet, changes the words, or maybe changes the grammatical structures, turning a complete sentence into an adjectival modifier, prepositional phrase, or something like that. The AI, which mostly does that, is still coerced by its own design to have to say something, even if it doesn't know the right answer. So the problem is that people who've actually tried to use AI in the workplace to replace human workers have found that they have to spend a lot of time going back and checking what the AI had produced to check for errors. Blatant nonsense. Even if you feed a transcript directly to it, about 5 to 20% of what it will give back is total nonsense, because once again it's coerced to have to say something even if it doesn't know the right answer. This is called hallucination. The problem is that it doesn't actually notify you which is which. If 20% of the time it's nonsense, it would be helpful if that were somehow like in red or something, but there's no indication. So the people who are using AI to save time are now actually losing time, spending all of their time going back and checking what it said. So the promises that are being made with regard to this technology are things which are not really matching up with the reality of people who actually are using it for more serious purposes than writing 2 to 3 page paper in a joke of a college course over a short book, which already has been assigned millions of times, so there's already plenty of information about it online to steal. The problem, once again, is the cost of this is so enormous that Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's old company, the expert business consulting company within Massachusetts, at least at that time Romney was working for them, has recently estimated that the amount of investment into AI at the moment, the data centers, which are the only reason the economy has not gone into recession, the only reason the economy has grown at all in the United States this year, is non-residential construction, aka data centers. Well, the amount of money going into the data centers and the chips from NVIDIA is so gargantuan that Bain Capital estimated the AI companies would have to fairly soon make $2 trillion per year to actually turn a profit on this amount of investment. Well, if you crunch the numbers on this, you'll find that even if ChatGPT were to charge a monthly fee for every person who used it, they still would not be able to come anywhere close to that $2 trillion number. $2 trillion per year in revenue is a number so vastly unrealistic for the sort of companies that we're dealing with here, in which you're once again basically just helping college kids cheat on their homework, that it's actually mathematically impossible for all of this to be profitable. Instead, what we're seeing is a repeat of the dot-com bubble of the late 1990s, something which is brought up over and over again by people who are honest enough to talk about this for what it really is. In the dot-com bubble, you had the stock market reach an all-time high on the expectation that any company that took a word from the dictionary and then added .com to it was worth an extraordinary amount of money, even if for many of these companies there basically was no company behind that name. For many of these companies, they literally had no business plan, and in many cases no income. They literally had no income because there was no business there. It was just a name, and the expectation that in the future the internet would be apportioned into various real estate spaces drove the speculative bubble to absurd heights because it was still assumed in the late 1990s that the only way people would use the internet would be to literally type something they were interested in, like pets, and then add .com and then go directly to the site. Anyone who uses the internet today, though, knows that that's absolutely not how it works. How many websites do you go to by actually typing in blank .com, .org, etc.? You probably don't even know whether the sites you go to most often are .org, .net, or .com, some other country's area code or whatever they're called or not. You probably have no idea because that's not how you use the internet. So the .com bubble reached an all-time high on an expectation which was impossible to live up to for these companies, many of whom didn't even exist. What we find now is a similarly absurd overvaluation of the stock market, but in order to fund not just the stock price of non-existent companies, but rather to throw an enormous amount of resources down the rat hole of wasted investment by really wasting an enormous amount of energy on these data centers that risk cutting off a huge number of Americans from access to electricity, wasting an enormous amount of water for something which at the end of the day is, once again, basically like a thesaurus or a spell check. This is the sort of thing which is, however, continuing to go on, not because it actually is what it appears to be, but rather because it allows the corporations to get away with doing something they actually need to do. If they say that they're laying off tens of thousands of corporate employees because the AI has made so much progress that it can now do their jobs, that sounds like a good thing. In fact, the companies are rewarded for doing this because they're on the bandwagon of progress and going to become more profitable as a result. If they say, however, that they have no choice except to lay off as many American workers as they can because they can no longer afford to pay their bloated salaries that they had to pay them to keep up with the cost of living due to Biden inflation, if they say that they have to lay them off to rehire people to do the exact same job in the quote-unquote third world countries with the lowest wages like India, Philippines, etc., well, then that doesn't sound as much like progress. In fact, that sounds like the start of a recession. It sounds like a full-blown economic collapse in the United States in which people are being permanently displaced from the socioeconomic class they had grown accustomed to being in. For if you listen to the testimony of people who've actually been laid off from these high-paying corporate positions in the past few years, you'll find a similar story repeated over and over again. People will note, I went from $200,000 a year to homeless within 8 months because I never found another job in the same field. I went from 6 figures to delivering on DoorDash because there was never another job to replace the one I lost. Not because AI is actually doing it, but because it's gone to the so-called third world. In fact, one meme holds, don't you know AI stands for actually Indians? And this is a situation which the U.S. cannot get out of because other countries have had their currency devalued by money printing, like Venezuela or Zimbabwe. But they did not have the world's reserve currency. America is doubly screwed here because their currency is losing its actual value compared to, say, gold, at the same time that the value of the dollar remains stubbornly high compared to other world currencies just because it has reserve status. This creates a situation in which it's literally impossible for the American worker to compete because even though his or her money is actually losing its value to the point that you can't buy dinner and drinks at a fancy restaurant in a major American city for less than $300 now. If you go to a really nice restaurant, your bill will be $300 plus for one meal. And then your rent, $5,000 a month average in New York City. You need so much more money to keep up with the cost of living because your money has lost its value in an inflationary situation. And yet you still can't compete against the other countries because compared to the dollar, their currency is still so much lower. I'm actually making more money per book sold now than I did 6 years ago, despite the inflation, etc., because the value of the dollar has gone up relative to the Indian rupee. If I sell a book in America, that money comes to me translated into rupees as more money. So this is a situation in which the American worker can be told, oh, it's actually a sign of progress that you've lost your job, because they have to maintain the illusion of the ascending arrow even as everything is getting much worse.